Hello, everyone. We are back for another episode of the Archery CoachCast. This is a episode that Doc here, my guest, but also co-founder of International Archery Institute. Um, we've talked about this discussion many times, and Doc is influential in the start of International Archery Institute, and as well in my success as a coach and some of the things that I've learned. Um, just to preface where we are, where we've come from. Doc was a co-instructor in my USA Archery Level 3 course years and years ago with Larry. That's how we met. And we just became friends right away. And as our friendship has developed, we realized that, in certain ways, although I'm on the competition side and whatnot, we've been chasing a lot of the same things in parallel to each other in lives unknowingly associated. So, Doc, can you first of all, welcome to your own podcast in some ways.
Uh, I'm,
um,
I'm
Doc,
glad
can
to
you
be me. Yeah.
what's that?
I'm glad to be me.
I'm glad you are you. Can you uh, give us some of your educational background, obviously, as well? But can you give us, let's start with just your background and how you got into archery and how long you've been involved in archery and some of the opportunities that you've come across. And then we'll get into the topic for today, which is the hypothesis around recreational archery and just the health and wellness benefits of archery. And just there's so many, gosh, this can go in so many directions. But let's start with talk about, and I know that you don't like it, but let's talk about you. Give us some feedback. Tell us about Doc McCune and how Doc got into archery.
Well, how Doc got into archery was when I was a young boy. My grandfather was just retiring from his job. We had been here in this country from Scotland as dairy farmers from very early on, late 1700s. And he was one of the first McCunes off the dairy farm. And he only had a third grade education, third reader, they called it then, but was pretty much a genius in math and ended up, by the time I was being born, he was the CFO of People's Natural Gas Company, which is a fairly large utility natural gas company in the Pennsylvania area. And he was retiring as I was being born, and he sort of took me on as a project to keep himself busy and from going totally crazy, I think. So we got to know each other pretty well. And by the time I was in early grade school, one of the things that was pretty clear is I absolutely hated school, and that's not an unusual thing for many people. But I had spent most of my time on the farms, and I wanted to be on the farm. We still had farms. And I wanted to be on the farm. And so going to school was an interruption to my day, even as a young kid. And I had an awful time reading. I couldn't understand why anybody would want to do it when you could do other things that were much more fun. And he sort of latched on that and helped me learn how to read. And one of the things he gave me to read one time, he was extremely well read. He spoke two languages, Gaelic and also English, obviously, and knew Latin very well. He had taught himself these things because he wanted to be an educated person, and so uh, he felt reading was very important, and so he introduced me to reading by having me read things I was interested in. And even as a young kid, he had a book up on he had bookshelves in his study and at home, a lot of books, and he was well read in these. And he then there was a little book up there that had a little Indian boy on it with a bow like this. And I forget who wrote it. I know it was about the Mohawk Nation. We're in Pennsylvania here, so it'd be north of us, up through New York State, up through New England, and how they taught their young guys how to shoot a bow. And how they taught them to shoot a bow is they worked with an elder to make their own bow. And so my grandfather and I decided to do that. Our farms, which he didn't live on anymore, lived in a little town, Latrobe. Some people have heard of that because they may have heard of Arnie Palmer and Fred Rogers and so forth, both of whom were close friends of mine. We all grew up together. And we just, as we started to do this, we wanted to find the right kind of wood. And in the book, the little boy made his bow with an elder out of Osage. And the lanes to our 3 then existing dairy farms that were in the family were lined with Osage orange. And so we went about, I was probably 6 when we started construction. And that took almost a year because you have to cut the piece of wood and then you put it in the spring and you let the water flow through it to get the resins out and set so they won't twist the bow. And we did it right. My grandfather was also a wonderful cabinet maker, so he had no problem doing this. Finally had the bow made. And on the 3rd shot, as I was pulling it back, I was pulling this back and the upper limb broke, flew back, hit me in the head here. There's still, you can't see it too well anymore, but there's a scar there, which marked me for archery for life. And blood was all over the place. My grandfather comes running over and I thought, oh shit, this is the end of the archery business. And his concern was that I was bleeding and no, his concern was I was crying. I mean, we were Scots, men didn't cry. And so even boys. And so he tried to calm me down. He said, why are you so upset? And I, it wasn't because of all the blood coming down across my face. It was because my bow was broken. And it took us 1.5 years to make it, and do it right. And so he said, and this is during World War II, we did have gasoline power equipment on the farms, but we couldn't use any of the gasoline for automobiles. He did have an automobile, but hardly used it because the gas was all highly regulated. And so a few weeks later, he said, when I said that my bow's broken, and he said, well, Dickie, my name's Richard, and he always called me Dickie. So he said, well, Dickie, I guess we're just going to have to get you a real bow. And a close friend of his lived in a town nearby in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, who had a sports shop. And we ended up going there on the bus one day. That was probably about an hour ride from where we lived in Latrobe. And he bought me a bow. It was a Pearson bow because Ben Pearson was the first person to ever make production-made bows. And so it was one of the first bows that would be hanging on racks in sports shops. Otherwise, if you had a bow, it's something you made yourself pretty much at that point. And so that was my first bow. I started shooting. I trained myself because we knew no one else in the world who had a bow other than the picture of the little Indian guy on the front of the book. And so I taught myself to shoot, and I became pretty good with it. I remember I wish I had an arrow right here, but this pen will suffice. And so if this is the nock, I would hold the nock like this between my thumb and forefinger, like a piece of a vice grip. And even then, my hands were pretty strong because on the farms, I was what was called the finisher. So when you milk cows with the new milking machines that were coming out, they didn't milk them dry. And so someone had to complete the milking. And so here was this little 6 or 7-year-old guy underneath the cow, finishing them off so they wouldn't get mastitis and die. And my hands were quite strong. The next major step for me in archery was a few years later, and I still knew no one else who shot a bow. But a friend of my dad's, who was a scoutmaster, came to him, and he knew of my interest in archery, and he said at the local scout camp, every county seemed to have a scout camp, and so this was the Westmoreland Scout scouting operation scout camp called Camp Wesco for Westmoreland County, that there was going to be an archer there, a famous archer there, he didn't mention the name, who was demonstrating how to shoot bows. And at that point, Cub Scouts had just started, and I was one of the first Cub Scouts in the area. And so I was allowed to go to this thing on a Saturday. And I saw this guy comes out with a fellow. They drove in an old Dodge bread truck. There was just sort of poorly painted to cover up the logo on it. And they had this thing full of archery equipment, and this fellow got stuff out, and his helper would set things up and they would shoot. And then one of the shots that really caught my attention was they would put 2 clay birds in a hand trap and throw it up, and the birds, of course, would go out like this, the clay birds. And this guy would have an arrow knocked in his bow, and then one along the side of the riser with the knock and fleshings down here. And he would hit the first one and grab this and shoot the second one. I thought that was pretty good shooting, you know? And so I asked the scoutmaster if I could talk with this guy, because I said I think I could do that. Yes, little snotty nosed 10-year-old kid probably at that point. And so he went over and talked with this fella. All we knew was his name was Mr. Hill. And so this guy says, yeah, I went at my next break, bring the young lad over and I'll show him a few things. And he reaches in the back of his truck, and there he had a little Pearson bow, almost identical to mine. It was laying in the back of the truck there. He puts an arrow in it, and I start to pull it back, and he said, no, son, that's not the way to pull an arrow. I thought the vice grip idea was a pretty good idea. And he said, no, you got to put your fingers like this. And he shows me how to put my fingers. And what he did was 1 above, 2 below. I thought that was the dumbest thing I ever heard, because why would you want to put your fingers in the way of the string? I mean, think about it. Yeah, it could rip your fingers off. So he shows me how to do this. And I said, okay. But first, he wanted to see if I could shoot. So his guy throws a clay bird out along the ground, out of the hand trap, and I pull up, because my brothers used to throw stuff for me and I'd shoot it. And it was going along the ground, and I pull up and shot, and boom, hit it. He said, oh, that was probably just good luck. And so he said, let's try another. And I hit that one. And then his break was done. He had to go back to demonstrating archery. He said, at my next break, I want your scoutmaster to bring you over. He says, I think you have some potential. About 5 years later, my father, who worked in the steel mills, helping the war effort, he worked double shifts. I hardly knew the guy until after the war. They worked 6 days a week, double shifts. And he won in a lottery among the guys a ticket to a local sports shop where the sports organization, where they were showing a film of an archer, an internationally known archer who shot an elephant. And so we wanted to go see that. So we go to see that. And during the presentation, when this fellow stood up and started talking about how he got ready to shoot this elephant, I leaned over to my dad and I said, that's the fellow that was at the scout camp. My dad being a Scot, I mean, we only have 2 gears on and off, and that's either angry or pleasant. And he leans over to me and says, no, that can't be. This is a famous archer from all around the world. So at the break, I asked my dad if I could go up and talk to this fellow. He recognized me for some reason. And we started talking a little bit. And that's when I found out that my first archery lesson, how to hold correctly on the string, was from Howard Hill. So that got me started. I never had another archery lesson until I met Larry Wise. Actually, I don't think.
I was just going to say, Doc, there's not too many people in the archery industry at all that can say they even knew or met in that capacity Howard Hill. So,
I am awfully old.
well, I mean, you've been around. You've been around the galaxy a few times. Around the sun. So,
Yeah, on
only
the
only
4th of June, I start the 83rd ride around. So, but you know that was for me, it was really a significant thing for this little semi farm kid, and so I got into archery. I remember when I shot my first 2 or 3 deer I shot with a bow, even though I had a rifle. You were only allowed 1 deer a year then, so I would always fill my tag before the rifle season started. And I remember the Latrobe Bulletin came out and took pictures of this young guy that shoots a bow or shoots a deer with an arrow. A big deal. And that really got me into it. And I was pretty active in archery till I ended up going through. And you would wonder why someone that hated to read ends up actually graduating from high school, but then going on to college, and then they ended up eventually with 5 academic degrees, two bachelors, 2 masters, and 2 doctorates. But it's because once I sit down, I don't move very quickly, so I end up getting those degrees. But the one has helped me a great deal and has helped me immensely in archery, because that degree is really about natural systems and how to understand how we interact as human beings, or any biology continuously interacts with the natural system. And then I ended up teaching I had thought I wanted to be a physician, but when I went off to college pre-med, I just really wasn't interested in the biology stuff so much, and the math and all that. And so I switched over to psychology, and I did a blend of that. So educational psychology, which has helped now again. And then along the way, as I kept going further, I ended up also with a couple degrees in theology, and was a pastor for a brief while. Because I wanted to blend clinical work with the pastor, became a clinical chaplain. And all these things eventually lined me up for the archery stuff. I had no idea that was all going to happen, but what really happened was, one of the days, and I ended up teaching actually altogether almost 40 years in 3 or 4 different major medical schools here in the Eastern United States. And I taught the theory of natural systems, because that's not taught in medicine. And that's why Western medicine gets so far afield from really seeing the whole person and seeing what's going on with them. And so we actually taught the courses, whether anyone learned anything or not. I enjoyed doing it. One day, and then I would teach in the mornings on Fridays, 8 till 1. And then in the afternoon from 3 till 5 or so, I had a group that we would do actual patient care. These are all graduate medical people. They all have their doctorates of nursing and medicine and therapies and so forth. But we were doing a special study of making patients the head of their own medical team. And these were terminally ill cancer patients, by and large. There were some other chronic illnesses, so one day coming home from that day, a very long day, but I just loved it. And I started feeling ill, thinking I was getting the flu, because everyone else was getting the flu. It was in March. We had already taken our flu. You had to, if you worked the clinical area, you had to get a flu shot in October, then one towards the end of February, because by that time they had, reintroduced some other things to the cocktail, and because of the different varieties of viruses and the bacteria that was running around. And on the way home, I thought, I was feeling crappy. And that night I was feeling even crappier, and I went to bed early. And during the night, I realized I was having a stroke. And that's a pretty scary experience. And during that time, I fell into this deep sleep. And I won't say too much about this, because you'll think I'm real Looney Tune, which I probably am. But I
I
had
played the fifth on that one.
three nights in a row. I had the similar dream in which I was being led to believe I had still some very special work to do, and this had to do with how human beings, in this case, could heal, once they had become ill. And so the short of that very long story was that each of the three nights was a very similar dream. In the first night, the dream ended with the fact that all that I had learned about psychology as a clinical psychologist and as a professor in natural systems theory, which is the Bowen theory I learned at Georgetown with the founder, Dr. Murray Bowen, that I would be using that. And then the next night was that the work would involve archery, because it was very important to human health and wellness. And the conclusion of the third dream was that a lot of this would be based in my knowledge of a gray fox. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've really slipped off the edge here, and I shouldn't even be taking aspirin. And later, when I started feeling a little better, and the next morning I was taken off to the hospital, and they found out I had an attack of bacteria that had come up through my nose, sort of similar to what COVID has been doing, and affected and infected my midbrain around the pituitary, and was troubling my whole autonomic nervous system. And I survived that for one reason or another. And my physician, who had been a student of mine many years before that, knew my interest in not using much of the pharmacological remedies and using natural remedies. If I would have practiced, I'd have been a naturopath. And so that got me off on a track. And then to try to look at my diet and fitness, get back into more exercise, because when you're already working 10, 12-hour days and teaching on top of that, it doesn't leave a lot of time. And so my fitness had gone downhill. I had been a long distance runner for a number of years and had given that up. So I got back to these things, and the other thing she said, you're going to have to do something that's going to help you get your strength back. And if any of you have ever had a stroke, whether it's a blood stroke or an infection, you lose muscle strength, like it just drops off your body. And so she recommended that it would be something that would help me hold focus, because I had a hard time focusing on things in terms of seeing, but also focusing, mentally, holding on to a topic. And then she recommended that it would have to be something that would be repetitive. And I asked her what she thought that would be. She said, well, maybe skiing or golf. Well, I could barely walk. I couldn't imagine putting boards on my feet and jumping down a hill. And because I had skied, I was from Western Pennsylvania, where there's some decent ski slopes, and I had done some of that. But that didn't appeal to me. And golf, I would have made former President Jerry Ford look like Arnie Palmer. In fact, when Arnie won his first green jacket, he came back to the high school. He was 6 or 7 years older, and I came back to the high school to show kids how to use a driver and stuff. And my turn came up in a gym class. I took a couple of swats at the thing, and he said to me, because he knew me pretty well, he said, Dick McCune, stick to archery. He certainly was right. So that got me into this whole thing. And I said to my physician, I said, Becky, how would archery work? I mean, that's something I've done a lot, and I'd like to get back to it. My bow hung in the rafters of my basement. It was a Fred Bear Kodiak Magnum, I think. Still have the bow. It's in great shape yet. And so she said, I don't know much about it. Tell me about it. She said, sounds like it has some potential. And I got back into shooting, and almost immediately, and I couldn't pull that bow, 55-pound bow. recurve. And so my brother who lived with me too, in my house, he went to a nearby sports shop and bought me a little kid's bow. And I shot in the basement of the pasteboard box until I could shoot again. And then started gradually coming up with the power of a bow. Ended up over at Lancaster Archery here in central Pennsylvania, and ended up shooting there. And everyone that was shooting was reporting in one fashion or another that when you shoot, it makes you feel better. And I'm hearing stuff like this, and that's what was my experience too. I thought it was just because I returned to something I love to do, but they were giving the same report in one fashion or another. And I'm a researcher, basically neurological researcher. If we had to really pin me down in terms of a natural environment and how everything works together. And I thought, that's a heck of a research question. Why does archery make you feel good? Because a feeling doesn't just drop out of the air or just conjured up in your head that you think I want to feel good. I mean, it's electrical, it's biochemical, it's physical. It has to do with gravity and that's in the system around you. So that's what got me into research about that, and read everything I could get a hold of. I had access to all the medical libraries because I taught in them. And a friend of mine who had studied to be a neurosurgeon, had become a pastor, and I had helped him a number of times in his church when he needed some help. And he and I had kept contact, and but he, even though he had sort of abandoned medicine just as he was ready to start some of his clinical work to head towards becoming a neurosurgeon, is what he wanted to do. He never really got back to that, but he stayed interested and was reading everything he could read, and he always did, about what was going on in the brain and the new brain studies. So he was on one. His name was Bob Pope, Pope. So every Wednesday afternoon, we set this time aside. He lived not too far from me, and the Pope and I would meet, and we'd talk about archery and what was going on in people's heads, and that ended up to bring us to a pretty good understanding, actually, of what's taking place. And without having to set up major research studies ourselves, we would like to now do that and really loop back on this hypothesis. The hypothesis is basically this: that if you keep yourself physically well, in terms of exercise overall, not just your upper body to pull the bow, but overall, and if you eat a diet that's fit for you, not fit for a particular diet that's conjured up by somebody that wants to sell stuff to you, but it's done from a blood study that tells you exactly what you need, probably when you need to eat, and probably also how it needs to be prepared. If you could do that on a regular basis and then shoot archery as well, and I don't mean shooting 100 arrows a day, but at least 2 or 3 times a week, every day if possible, no more than a dozen arrows, and just trying to do it right and do it well, you will feel better. And my hypothesis is that those 3 things put you in a proper alignment within your body, physiologically, but neurologically, biochemically, electrically, to interface with the natural system around you and gravity and everything. And you will, even if you get ill, you will recover faster. And the more we've seen this, the more, and Frank has had some experiences in his own practice of archery with the people who've come to him to be trained, some spectacular things that have happened with people doing this, and I've had them too. And I'm hoping that through our institute here, which we really have set up as a university, that we can start to do some very serious research of my hypotheses. Because, like I say, I'm going to be starting my 83rd trip around the sun. I can't have too many more of those. even if I get healthy or stay healthy. I've been having some problems lately, mainly with allergies. There's a pollen around here you can walk on right now. But you get through that stuff, but you recover. And if you're doing those things, my belief is, it's a hypothetical belief, is that that this is really a very necessary activity for wellness. Archery is, partly because it's so old. I mean, there was almost no other behavior other than running and throwing something, that all of those have become sports in one fashion or another, whether it's throwing a javelin or a spear, or the quarterback throwing the football and running. Those two things, running, throwing, and then someone conjured up the machine that became the bow. That stuff's inbred in us, and that inbreeding goes on from generation to generation. And here's a place that my friend Bob Pope, the Reverend Bob Pope, has been so helpful, because he could go into the research. And in the last 20 years, we won't go into these details, maybe later we can, if we do this stuff. It was, most people have heard of Mendel in terms of genetics, and how genes transfer from generation to generation through the sex cells themselves and so forth. We all know a little bit about that, like we know a little bit about finance and the weather too, but so we know something about that. And Mendel was the guy with his peas. He was a brother in a Catholic order. And so he studied how this happens genetically. We're saying that it's beyond genetics, that you can have experiences that somehow become part of your genes. And that was heretical for years, until we had things like the electron microscope and other kinds of ways of really taking a very careful look at things, MRIs and CAT scans and all these things. We can now see that on the actual stem cell, the dendron, that when someone has a spectacular experience, I mean, not just the everyday thing, but something really outstanding, positive or negative, there's an actual biochemical and probably electrical encoding, almost like tattooing on the cells. And those are on the stem cells that become our genes that we pass forward sexually. And so from generation to generation. And I was saying to Frank the other day, I think if we could find a group of people that had never heard of or seen a bow, and put one on the ground, probably strung, because most people that even know about the bow can't string the bow. So, and an arrow there that has a knock on it, that person would probably pick it up and within a few seconds would be shooting it, because it's part of who and how we are. Yeah. The responses of that are very vast. And I think it's not just to help us feel good, but we could be on the edge of understanding some very, very significant things about PTSD, a horrible experience that we could learn to identify early when it starts to re-happen with something else, not the roadside bomb blowing up, but someone the next aisle over in the grocery store knocking a stack of cereal over that frightens us, or something like Alzheimer's. And I think that doing this kind of research and staying in those basic things can really help us move ahead in terms of understanding health and wellness.
Yeah.
Although the best way to stay healthy, I'm convinced, is to never get sick in the first place.
Yeah.
And maybe shooting archery can help us do that.
I want to touch upon a few things because they've been influential in the way that I coach. Some of the people here that are viewing are here because they're familiar with some of the coaching that I do and the stuff that I do. But So we're talking about that good feeling, right? And it's actually something just registered to me that I did not realize. So I'll get into that first, talking about like PTSD and stuff like that. Um, Years ago, when I got back into hunting specifically, which was right around when our son was born, um, I probably struggled for I'm going to say like 6 months or so after a significant uh, fire that we had here in town, where we rescued one lady, tried to get to another lady. The fire pushed us back. We ended up vacating the building. There was fire underneath our ladder as we were coming out. Like it was really for me, it was a pretty horrific thing.
Right.
And for at least 6 months, I had nightmares, multiple times a week, if not every night. Wake up, cold sweat, whatever, just kind of just suppressed it. And it was shortly thereafter that I really got back into archery. And what maybe in some ways, one of the reasons I got back into it is because it made me feel good. I knew from my childhood, growing up, shooting, competing, some of my earliest memories as a child is shooting archery with my dad in the yard
Uh-huh.
at 2 years old. I
Oh,
remember it like it was yesterday. There's not a lot that I remember from 2 years old. That's one of the things. Um, so, and then in our years of our friendship and discussing this topic and these things, and me working with kids that have some health issues or learning disabilities, and realizing that in like that idea of every time you do a thing and you do it and you enjoy it and it goes the way you want it to and it makes you feel good, it like we talked about, it makes a little mark in your brain, all right, or in your DNA from what the discussion we're having.
or the reverse of that,
Yeah,
if it's a bad thing,
right.
but not just
So
a little bad, a big bad thing.
right, so one of the things that I'm doing is in my coaching, or the way that I approach coaching, is that our goal is to recreate the perfect shot. Well, how do we do that, and how do we find that good feeling? Because and I've talked it on multiple podcasts and things like, well, I want shooters to learn what the shot is supposed to feel like, and what is the way that we make the shot feel as good and controlled and beautiful as possible. So through research, through working with Larry, through working with you, we learned that the body has a way of repeating a feeling. Well, by
Mhm.
repeating a feeling, we want to optimize the efficiency of that. And that's where biomechanics of the body's position and all that stuff comes in. So I've sort of adopted a lot of that into my coaching to say, okay, well, if this hypothesis is true, we should be able to take an archer, put them in the best position as possible so that they then can experience the best feeling as possible, and then learn to repeat that feeling by going through the proper shot process.
Yep.
And and in my opinion, and it's not it's maybe like an outlying point of what you're doing, but I think that that's the key to target panic. I honestly think, in my wholeheartedly believe that, and we've talked about target panic a little bit, and I think that it's an extremely misunderstood topic,
Yeah.
and that the idea of controlling the shot isn't really the focus. It's the focus is supposed to be on the feeling, because our body has the ability to repeat the feeling. So my coaching, my theories, the way that I do drills, the way that I teach kids, and the way that I program and all that, it's based on the idea that you need to be able to duplicate the best shot possible as many times in whatever format that means. It doesn't have to be the full shot. It can be parts of the shot, but it has to be done correctly, and it has to be done as many times. The more that we do it good, the better we're going to remember it, and the better our archery is going to be overall. And I really think, and target panic is always a big topic amongst compound, especially amongst barbell and the trad world. And you have had a huge influence on my approach to addressing target panic for that reason, because your research is unmatched in the archery world. Your research is unmatched when it comes to this topic. And when we're talking, we have when we have a thing that affects so many people, and we try to explain to them, here, this is why. This is the conversation that they need to hear, because it literally, every time that you do a thing, it doesn't have to be archery, but you do it and it makes you feel good, you are going to remember it. Your body's going to remember that. Your brain is going to remember that. Your natural system is going to remember that, and you'll be able to repeat it. So,
and that brings me to the final, actually, punchline here is that the term I started using then about archery, but it can be about running, actually, and it can be about throwing. And those are the basics of almost any motion sport, right? I mean, even if you're swinging around the high bar, that's a combination of all that stuff. So the actual activity plus those other things, if you do this without the rest of the natural system, without knowing how to eat the right stuff and keep yourself physically fit within the natural system, which is based on your integrity with gravity, and keep your muscles fit, then you will be able to heal quicker. Your body will work as it's supposed to. That doesn't mean you're going to live forever, but you could die a very healthy death. That sounds like a stupid thing, but I used to say a lot of stupid things to medical people just to shake the crap out of them, because they don't. And I imagine there's some physicians here and I've actually had a couple of good friends who were physicians. Everyone makes mistakes, but that is what helps. Those things are what helps our body heal. A physician cannot heal you. A surgery cannot heal you. A pharmacological mix of something cannot heal you. But the basics of this universe and how we deal with them vis-a-vis our own body, put together correctly, can work. And the recreational, and that's the term for recreational, and
right.
that's where we get the word recreational, is that we can continue to keep ourselves healthy. You bite your lip in the morning chewing your cereal, and usually by evening the mucosa has gradiated over it and the wound's almost healed. You break your leg skiing, well, that's going to take a little longer. You may need some surgeries and so forth. If you don't get infected, maybe you can even keep the leg. But these are the things that can be much more integral because of doing those basic things. The PTSD stuff, so you're driving along in the Humvee and something blows up and your guy sitting next to you, his guts blow all over you. That's a traumatic thing, you won't forget that. So when you hear a loud noise, you have to be, but you can quickly, because of being healthy in these other ways, learn to differentiate. That was something falling down in the next aisle in the grocery store. That was not a roadside bomb, and I'm okay. That's how to get in charge of PTSD.
Right.
How the cells work and so forth, and that's part of Alzheimer's. We're just beginning to see these things, but I'm believing, and those are the two most important things I think in our healthcare system: learning how to maybe offset, if not delay, or maybe even treat, if you will, not having dementia, and die with a healthy brain and body, because we're going to die. When the egg hits the sperm, the clock's set. Or if we just want to feel good about something, we can put this together. And archery is something, I think. I mean, you probably can't play golf forever, but you could play it pretty long in your life.
Sure.
Some people can ski to very late in their life, but if you practice right and don't try to pull a bow significant enough that you can shoot an elephant. We don't have them on the game tickets here in Pennsylvania right yet, but you're going to be more healthy.
Absolutely.
And you can have a heck of a lot of fun.
Well, and again, to kind of go back to that target panic, that idea. We started archery out of necessity, not out of fun, but it was still fun.
Yeah.
We started archery as humans for the necessity to provide for ourselves and our families. But here we are still doing the same thing, hundreds of years later, thousands of years later. And even in the competition world, and I try to emphasize this to people, and I have to, I give credit to some of the youth shooters that I work with, is re-energizing and re-establishing the fact that they're shooting the sport because they love it, and they have to concentrate on just that one thing, concentrate on just shooting that one arrow. Like, that literally is the key to target panic, providing you are in the best position. The problem is that when your body's not in a good position, your body hates, your body doesn't want to be there. It doesn't work. It's you need to fix that. You need to, because your body's wants to do this thing and wants to enjoy it, but when your body isn't working, it can be tough to concentrate on those right things. And it's that idea of remembering that, listen, we love what we're doing. We're not concentrating, we're not worried about the value of the arrow, we're not worried about as much where the arrow hits. We're worried about the feeling.
Yeah.
Was it a good shot? What could I have improved upon? And it's just like, and maybe it took us to have this podcast and to have this conversation to really realize where that relationship is, and how it has so much effect on, we have to remember that the enjoyment of the sport is so much bigger than the value of the arrow and what we're doing and the history of it, and all that's involved in archery is just it's such a deep topic. It's profound, and most people skip right by it. They just want to jump on social media and post how awesome they're shooting, and then it comes around to when it matters most, and everything falls apart.
Right.
And because we're focused on the wrong things, and we're not realizing how much fun we're still having. And it's just this, I don't know, it's a profound topic. And we're already 45 minutes into this discussion, which is fine. We can keep going if you'd like, or we can continue this as a part 2, and make this like a full-on series, because in my opinion, that's the direction this is going to end up going with some of our guests that we have lined up and stuff like that.
I felt for myself. I became a level 3 a number of years ago, and I've repeated that to keep it up to date and so forth. But I really have no interest in going further with that, and because there's a lot of people that do that, and there's not a lot of people that do this. And so, in my last few years on the planet, I want to continue to do something significant this way. And then when the opportunity to put this organization together appeared, because of my wife trying to help our grandson at the computer, when the 12-year-old, when he was out of school because of COVID and so forth, and I saw Zoom working, I thought, there's no reason why we can't do this way. And Frank and I started talking, and we included Larry, and off it went. And so we're pretty excited about this, and we've been able to train in 5 or 6 different countries now, actually, altogether. And language hasn't been a problem, because most people speak English mainly better than we do. And so that hasn't been a problem. But it's a wonderful thing, and it's fun to do. And if we can learn to have a little fun in our lives, that's pretty good elixir too.
Yeah, that is definitely. Daniel mentioned that we mentioned archery is in us, and he says that he is Native, and that bringing a program to Native youth in Maine, as this podcast has been a perfect approach for him, bringing it to them, maybe learning, maybe I appreciate the feedback there. I guess what Daniel's saying is it's helping him then bring archery to them,
Oh yeah.
and then helping grow the sport, and just to Daniel's point, part of the mission of IAI is, no matter what discipline of archery you shoot, or you coach, or you have an effect on kids or new shooters, adults included, is we want you to have the tools necessary to improve the first arrow. because the first arrow is the most important arrow, in my opinion, because the longevity of their involvement in the sport very well may be dictated on how their first experience goes.
Yeah.
And if you are, you know, and I've talked about this, and if you go to buy you go into a place and they throw a compound bow at you, and it's like Doc was talking, we were talking about another shooter is pulling 70 pounds and is way overbowed, and you go into this place and they give you that bow, you might shoot that bow for a few weeks, you might shoot it for a month, but if you're not having fun with it, and if you're not, you know, doing well with it, the longevity of your involvement in the sport, and most importantly as a bow hunter in many instances, is going to be limited. And that's one less bow hunter we have, that's one less archer we have, and that's one person that is missing out on an opportunity to really feel good about themselves over and over and over again as sort of therapy of sorts. You know, and that's kind of like one of the missions here is to
follow on Daniel's comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
A fellow who's become a friend of mine, Byron Ferguson, that some of you may know of, really a great longbow shooter and a bowyer, making bows and so forth, and does demos all over the place. I got to meet him, and he and I have done some shooting together. He has a shooting school in Western Tennessee at the Goodman Ranch. And a number of years ago, he was invited by the Navajo Nation to come out and to put on archery demonstrations for them. He said he was so intimidated by that, he almost decided not to even respond to the invitation. Because at least Howard Hill was part Cherokee, you know, and he had at least half of the right thing going for him. But Ferguson went there, and they had a great time shooting together. And the elders of the tribe who invited him and wanted him to come there, and because they had their own school going on there, teaching each other various kinds of things, the pottery, the weaving, the archery, and things like this. They also said that how he talked about archery helped them see what they had known for thousands of generations. But it's sort of the forest for the trees kind of thing, you know. It's so much part of you, you don't notice what's going on. Yeah. And Byron has responded really well to my notions, because he said that over the years when he's had difficult times, archery itself was really his psychiatrist. That's the term he used. And that's so. What tribe is Daniel, in what nation?
I don't know. Well, let's see if Daniel's still listening and can comment to that. And I've been blessed to become friends with Byron as well through my relationship with you, Doc. And, you know, and Byron actually in the beginning of IAI was sort of influential in many ways. And I'm sure that you will see Byron either on the podcast or maybe in some other higher capacity involved at some point in time. Byron's busy. He's getting back as COVID restrictions are released. I know Byron's doing more and more. But, you know, if you guys get a chance, for the followers that we have, whether you shoot compound, Olympic recurve, or bare bow, you should take an opportunity to watch Byron, listen to Byron talk about archery. He understands all aspects. He understands the idea of being the bow and being involved in the you know, that emotional side of the sport, but he also understands the marketable side of the sport as well. He's very good at that too. So, you know, he's got a lot of really good things.
His notion of becoming the arrow is so significant. Yes. Because
I think I said becoming the bow. Yes.
Well, they're pretty much needed together, and so I mean he's done some great stuff with that. And when you start to think that way, it really changes your thinking. But the most important part, and this is where I think the problems with what do you call it, target panic and so forth exist, is you actually think you're out there doing that yourself. You're only part of the process. You happen to be holding the bow and maybe pulling the arrow correctly. There's the bow's doing stuff, the arrow's doing stuff, gravity's doing. Can you imagine trying to shoot a bow in a zero gravity situation? You'd be bouncing around all over hell's half acre, you know. And so you got all this stuff working for you. And to me, that does something with target panic when you start to think this isn't just me performing here. I'm working within a total system that will work if I can repeat doing it correctly. That's Larry's thing with his
core archery.
What's the fellow that was his trainer who was the Olympic archery coach?
You're gonna put me on the spot, Doc.
He used to say that archery is a two-part process. Learn to shoot at 10 and repeat that.
Yes.
And you spend the rest of your life repeating that, you know?
Yeah, that's right. Looks like Daniel did respond. Halton Band of Maliseet. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly.
He's from Maine.
Yeah, look at in the chat there, Doc. His response.
I'm afraid to click on these things.
He says we're just reinforcing to them, or he's reinforcing to them what he's known all along. Yes, okay, I did say it. Halton Band of Maliseet is his tribe.
Okay.
Well, Daniel, I'm glad you were able to join in. That's pretty cool. And for those who are listening, again, the video version will be on YouTube, of course, and then the audio version will be on all of the podcast platforms. This will be a good one because there's not a lot of visual going on. This is a lot of it's all audio. But Doc, I think what we'll do is we will definitely pick up a part 2 here in the next few weeks. We'll be recording next week with professional archer Jack Wallace, Monday live. And we'll probably be talking a lot about 3D archery. And we're going to talk about Jack's role here with IAI here moving forward. We're lining up some others involved in archery that we're going to be working with. And then also along the lines of what Doc has been researching and Doc's Re-Creational archery and what really bringing I don't want to say high profile, but influential people in all aspects of these topics and these things that we're teaching and bringing to the table in the archery world, because nobody's done it. We want to make this information as available to as many people as possible.
And then, like I say, we have contact with some really significant people, and we'd met great people in archery. And so it occurred to me, and I sold it to my other colleagues here, the idea that we really need to form this up as a university, which part of the responsibility of the university is to gather a body of knowledge, but not just to possess that, but to continue to work on it. And that means research and understanding and practice and see it evolve and so forth. And it just doesn't become a dead book on the shelf. It becomes something that continues to live, and to be able to have other people from all ends of this planet participate in this in a really significant way, and with the technology that we can do it. Yeah. When I think I made my first phone call on a chair from the kitchen and the table of the farmhouse on this wooden box that had a magneto crank on it to ring up Helen down at the end of the wire, who was the operator, and she knew who was calling in, and I shouldn't really be trusted with this thing in front of me right now, but I became a pretty significant pilot and did my work flying all over the country and so forth. Never crashed once, So you can learn to use this technology for the good of everyone. It's an exciting time. It's been nice to be part of it.
Yeah, and I think another way to look at this, Doc, is that we're constantly learning and sharing, and sharing our experiences with the shooters that we work with, the people we work with. We're putting all of the stuff that we have to the test and saying, look, here's proof that it works. Here's proof that this is happening, whether it's in the way that we're coaching people, or the way that, like, we're working with shooters of all this archery disciplines online, or in the seeing the health benefits that have come with people I've worked with, people you've worked with, watching these things happen. It's very transparent here. Either it works or it doesn't. And we're providing that information to people through the university, or through the institute, and making it available and in a way that COVID allowed us to realize, wow, we were really onto something, and let's make this happen. So, all right. I think that's
All right.
that's a good start.
Yeah.
It's a good start.
Keep
Again,
starting every day.
yes. Thank you for joining us, everyone. And make sure you guys check out the YouTube version and all the audio versions. Doc, thanks for being the guest on your own podcast.
Okay, that was fun. Yeah. All right.
Bye.